few years ago, and it's important because it's also about how do you create more demand for that CO2. Anyway, it's an exciting time, and our panel here is going to talk about where's the momentum, what's going on. And I mentioned that coalition primarily because I wanted to tell you this panel is about what's going on. And the Carbon Capture Coalition, if you're interested in what's going on with federal policy, they're a great source for what's going on. How we've been able to do direct pay for 45Q. What about that 10-year extension for commenced construction? What about, what's the other big piece that they're pushing for? A lower threshold so that you can get some of those really innovative uses of CO2. So anyway, if you're interested, the Carbon Capture Coalition, you can look them up on the web, and they're a really good source for updates on federal policy. So the coalition is really pushing, but there's a lot of other people that really believe in carbon capture and storage. IEA, for example, the International Energy Agency, those folks that look at the big models, the technology models, for how do you solve for keeping temperature rise to 2 degrees or below. They do all these different modeling scenarios of different technologies, and many of the models used can't actually keep temperature below 2 degrees unless carbon capture, use, and storage is included in those models. And the ones that can solve, the cost of meeting the Paris Agreement is 2 to 3 times higher without carbon capture and storage. So IPCC, if you wanted to read that report that came out a couple days ago, they also identified CCUS as a critical technology for solving the Paris targets. But today we have 27 operating CCUS facilities, large-scale CCUS facilities. And most of the models that have looked at this say that we need an enormous amount more than, globally. And the models say we need almost 100 times that to be able to keep the temperature to 2 degrees or less. It's going to be a big challenge. But it is really exciting to see the momentum building on this. Policies are going into place. It's not just at the federal level, also at the state. And the uses of CO2 are drastically increasing. Now there's putting CO2 into pore space of cement. How exciting is that? Or making algae or synthetic fuels. I really think that synthetic fuels, that CO2 is going to be a key supply chain ingredient for synthetic fuels. And for many sectors, heavy industry, cement, steel, carbon capture, use, and storage is the only technology that you can really use for deep decarbonization. And synthetic fuel made out of CO2, I think that's going to be essential for dealing with aviation emissions. So anyway, it's a very exciting time, and we have a lot of momentum on this topic right now. I think it's pretty clear. We'll talk about some of that, and we have quite a pipeline, if you will, of new and planned projects. And some of those involve a hub system where you've got a group of companies in one place using a combined or a shared transport system and a shared infrastructure for storage. What does that do for you? That reduces the cost. And that's really key to making CCUS scale, is reducing the cost. So anyway, we've got some great speakers, some of whom showed up here at the very end, and you can't thank them enough for being willing to be up here at the very last minute. So let me tell you about them. Edwin Makkinga, he's the manager of carbon policy for Enbridge, one of North America's largest energy delivery companies. He's based in one of my favorite cities, Calgary, Alberta. Edwin leads the company's climate policy initiatives. Hopefully you're going to tell us a little bit more about what's going on in Canada, because the momentum for CCUS is not just here in the U.S. And then we also have Scott Lipton. Scott graciously agreed to join this morning, right? Can't thank him enough.
Late last night.
Late last night. Well, yeah, you had lots.
For those of you who know him, it is impossible to say no to JP Brisson. So
JP got called back to New York, kind of unexpectedly, and we were very appreciative that Scott jumped in to be on our panel. Let me tell you a little bit about Scott. He's the government affairs specialist with Aera Energy. Aera Energy is California's second largest producer of crude oil, and his primary focus at Aera is on carbon and climate-related policy, including carbon capture and storage. So how great is that at the last minute, right? But it even gets better, because we also have Andrew Wingate, who's also agreed to join our panel, and he's from Latham Watkins, JP's company. When did you get asked, Andrew? Half an hour ago?
This morning.
Okay.
But yeah, I've been working with JP for about 9 years, and I'm working with him on basically all of the CCS projects that he's on. So
again,
I'm the laboring oar on that boat.
At the last minute, I just can't thank you both enough for jumping in at the end, and Edwin for staying with me through this. So you can tell that I'm very excited and bullish on this market right now. But I get asked, really? This has been in the future. Do you really think it's going to go anywhere? I mean, really, 100 times greater? Do you really think? So I'm bullish, but I'm curious whether you guys think the momentum is really there. And I'd like to know why you think that. You go first, Edwin.
That's a great question. And I think we can look at it from a few different perspectives. I think on an international level, you've kind of talked about it already just in terms of the IPCC and the IEA, both really stating that in order for us to meet net zero, it's almost virtually impossible without the use of CCS. I think the 2018 IPCC report, when it talks about the pathway to 1.5 degrees, pretty much states the same thing. And even talking about increasing CCS to, I think it's between 5 and 10 gigatons per year in the second half of this century. I think I don't want to steal all you guys' thunder, but I can limit my comments maybe to Canada, and then you guys can. But no, I do, but I don't want to take everybody's. But anyway, at least on the public policy side in Canada, I think I'm particularly bullish with the release of the emissions reduction plan from the federal government last week, which basically lays out the Canada's plan to reach their 2030 and 2050 targets. And within that ERP, they're very, I would say they're very bullish on the use of CCS, which has been great. I think it was yesterday, actually, Canada released its federal budget for 2022. And we were long awaiting the details of an ITC, or an investment tax credit, on the use of CCS. So we got the details yesterday. So between 2022 to 2030, there's a 60% ITC on carbon capture using DAC, so direct air capture, and then 50% for everything else. So if we're looking at capturing emissions from natural gas fired generator, for example, and then a 37.5% ITC for the transportation and storage piece. And then to further incentivize CCS, they're basically keeping this limit up to, I think, 2030, and then post-2030 they're reducing it by 50%, the ITC. So really fairly bullish on getting action now in terms of carbon capture. And then even at the provincial level, I'm from Alberta, but from that perspective, the provincial government there is fairly bullish as well on the ability to generate credits from CCS that can be used, for the compliance market there as well. So I think from those reasons, I would be fairly bullish on it. Yeah.
I'm glad.
So thank you, Jen. I'll start federally in the U.S. and very briefly, and then work my way down to California. I think bullish on CCS federally because I think if you look at Build Back Better, which unfortunately has not passed and is likely dead, although I think there are ongoing negotiations, depending on which Politico or Vox article you read on any given Monday morning, then I think the key pieces that still seem to be alive is a very narrow climate package federally. And that seems to be what Senator Manchin, what Senator Sinema, what the Republicans are all sort of able, and most of the Democrats in the Senate are able to get around. And that will likely, obviously, I think, include 45Q, both the expansion and the extension.
When you say expansion, you elaborate with it.
I'm going to probably get my years wrong because I focus primarily on state policy, but I believe the current construction deadline is the end of 2026, and it would extend it out through, I believe, the middle of the 2030s. And raises the Class 6 point source credit to $85, so long as you have a project labor agreement or union labor component in the project. And so I think that's one reason why. And then if you think about it in California, well, obviously you heard Chair Randolph this morning speak about engineered carbon removal, I think very broadly, but you have a recent Stanford report, actually not that recent, a couple years ago now, Stanford Center for Energy, that identified that for California to reach its net neutrality goals, the state would need 100 million tons per year of sequestered carbon by 2045 in order to meet its net neutrality goals. And then you have the California scoping plan update scenario modeling just released by E3 that includes at some level carbon capture and sequestration in every single one of its pathways to reach net neutrality by 2045. And I have them in front of me. This is just on general industrial and the refining sector, so not oil and gas production, which we think, just as an editorial comment, we think is a failing of the scoping plan modeling. But just, to demonstrate for their alternative 3, which is sort of seen as one of the more moderate alternatives for the scoping plan, by 2035, it'll require 10 million tons annually of CCS. By 2045, 4 million tons. That obviously accounts for what they anticipate as a decline in transportation fuel production activities to be associated with the ZEV mandates in the state. But I think that still demonstrates from CARB's perspective and from E3's perspective, a significant reliance on CCS in order to meet their goals and through their model. And then I think at a more political level, and the other reason I'm very bullish on CCS in California is prior to last year, the last time you had a CCS piece of legislation introduced in the California State Legislature was 2012. It was Senate Bill 1139 by now Vice President of ESG at Chevron, Michael Rubio, when he was a state senator. You did not have another CCS bill until last year when you had Assembly Bill 1531 by Mr. O'Donnell out of Long Beach. So you had one bill in 2012, you had another bill in 2021. This year, 2022, you have approximately, depending on how you interpret the different pieces of legislation, you have anywhere from 12 to 14 different pieces of legislation explicitly focused on CCS. In the state of California. Those will do varying things. They're pilot projects, they're demonstration projects, or they're broader sort of facilitation efforts. But I think it's important that there is just a significant interest by the California State Legislature to see CCS be successful in the state of California in order for the state to meet its goals.
So policy in Canada, policy in the state of California. What about companies? Are you seeing a lot of interest on the corporate side?
Yes, definitely for companies that have significant emissions that are amenable to CCS. And what I mean by that is that their stream of emissions is fairly pure CO2 and it doesn't have a lot of other contaminants that need to be removed, because I think that's what's proven so difficult. And 10 or 15 years ago, what people were looking at was putting CCS on coal plants, and that's been the issues. You can't clean up the gas cost effectively. But when you're looking at streams from cement, from ethanol, from steam methane reformers, those are pretty pure streams of CO2, and they can be upgraded and then injected for a reasonable cost. So I'm pretty bullish with caveats. I think there's a lot of permitting and regulatory obstacles still. I mean, with 45Q, there's a limited universe of projects that are then cost effective, and I think that's been really helpful.
Class 6.
Yes, but again, Class 6, there's only 2 permits that have actually been issued, and then so are running as wells. So a lot of it is going to have to rely on EOR and the Class 2 permits. So, and with those projects, if there's oil involved and you're able to get to sink the fuel, or this would also apply to natural gas projects. If you're able to sink the fuel into California or Oregon potentially, you could take advantage of a second set of credits with LCFS, and to the extent that there are offset protocols that are approved for CCS, that will be an additional incentive.
I'm so glad you mentioned offsets. Because Bluesource, we do a few offsets, and maybe that extra little bit of incentive will push even a few more.
Exactly. A lot of it is a cost issue. CCS is expensive, and we need to have the incentive base there to support that for the long term, because it requires a significant upfront investment. The capture equipment is not cheap, pipeline is not cheap, and the Class 6 well is not cheap, and it takes a long time to set that up. So if there's uncertainty as to whether the programs are going to stick around or whether there will be the correct level of incentive, that's going to affect the willingness of companies to go into this space. And as you guys have all noted, there really isn't a scenario where we meet our climate goals without a significant involvement of CCS, because it's one of the only proven technologies that will reduce the hardest to abate emissions.
And it's great that you said proven, because I always hear, CCS is a new technology. It's new. It's actually been around 50 years. We've been doing CCS in the Permian Basin for 50 years. It's not new. But deep saline, putting it in cement, making algae and synfuels, that's new. Do you guys all know what Class 6, when we say Class 6 wells, do you know what that is? No? So EPA you have to have a water permit. You have to have a deep injection permit. If you're going to put it in a saline aquifer, that's a Class 6 well. If you're going to put it in enhanced oil recovery, you need a Class 2 well. The requirements for a Class 6 permit are significantly more onerous than to get it for an EOR, because you have other requirements that you have to meet too. So a Class 2 well is significantly easier and cheaper than a Class 6 well.
With the caveat being, Janet, except in the state of California.
Really? So Class 2 is cheaper? I mean, not cheaper even in California?
It's not a function of cost. It is a function of political will from the state of California to move forward with a Class 2 EOR project for CO2.
Well, there you go. Thank you. Anyway,
I just might, I'll add too, sorry. Just on the Canadian side, with the ITC that I was talking about earlier, it does not include EOR.
Oh, it doesn't?
It does not. So
interesting.
Yeah, which kind of gives you a perspective on what, the government does.
Alberta was one of the first. Well, it's actually Canada was one of the first with the Weyburn field, and that was EOR. But then the Shell Quest project was deep saline. But there were significant credits and incentives that went into getting that done. Okay. Well, Ed, maybe I can go back to you for a second, because I mentioned that whole hub system. Mm-hmm. I do think hubs are actually a significant way to reduce costs. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience is with Alberta has a hub system that went in 2020.
Yeah.
So maybe talk about that a little bit and how that fits into business fundamentals.
Yeah, that's right. So the first hub we had in Alberta was the ACTL, which is the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. It's currently attached to, I think it's a cement plant and a fertilizer plant. And I think it sequesters, 1.2 megatons per year, give or take. But currently we're looking at, or we're moving forward and advancing a project in Alberta as well, south of Edmonton. So it's an open source carbon hub. We've currently got two potential, project partners. So we've got a natural gas-fired generation facility owned by Capital Power. So they've just recently repowered their facility from coal to natural gas. And then we've also got an MOU with Lehigh Cement. So we would be sequestering, I think it's about 780,000 tons per year from them. And that would be North America's first full-scale application of CCS for a cement plant, which is pretty significant. On the, just in terms of, scale of emissions, currently we're looking at about 4 megatons per year of sequestration once that gets up and running. And given the fact that it's an open source carbon hub, certainly looking at other opportunities for emission sources within the general vicinity. When you think about the area south of Edmonton, it's fairly similar to, say like a Houston or somewhere else, just in terms of oil and gas refineries and whatnot. So I think there's about 25 megatons of emission sources around that area, so certainly potential for more than just our hubs. We've also partnered with, or created a partnership with First Nations. So we signed a letter of intent, I think earlier this year, with 4 First Nation communities in Alberta. So they have the opportunity to invest in both the transport and the storage assets, so they're able to generate revenue from that, as well as a Métis Nation. And then last week we got confirmation from the government of Alberta to kind of move forward in terms of this competitive process, in terms of getting pore space. So the next step for us would be to drill a couple of exploratory wells, just to get a sense of the geology there and confirm our initial kind of thoughts on what that looks like. And I think too, just thinking about the hub in more general, like I think you're right. Like it's just a matter of efficiencies and scaling. But I think that only goes so far if you've got a particular facility that's isolated and has good geology. Then obviously running a pipeline for 200 miles to get it to a suitable hub is definitely doesn't make sense. But I think just in terms of economies of scale, the whole hub is a great model for that. Not only for CCS, but also when you think more broadly about hydrogen, I think it's very similar as well.
We're going to come back to hydrogen.
Yep.
You're not getting off that easily.
Okay.
That's the necessary permit that you need in order to qualify for CCS credits. So part of it is a regulatory holdup.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right, Andrew. You don't have a project in California. There's a dearth of projects, even though we have probably one of the best pore space situations as identified by Lawrence Livermore National Lab in 2019. I think I sort of chalk it up to California has a 3P problem when it comes to CCS. It's permitting, it's pore space, and it's pipelines. Permitting and pipelines are probably closely associated. So I'll start with pore space first. California does not have a legal framework for pore space ownership in our public resources code. So there's right now, although it's in case law, there's no statutory delineation as to whom owns the pore space in California. You add on to that the LCFS pathway protocol, and I'm sorry if this is going to get too technical for anybody, but there's section 9 of the LCFS protocol, and then there's sections 9A and 9C. Underneath that, 9A requires a project operator to have 100% control over the pore space. This is to say that you can control exactly where the CO2 plume could potentially go as an operator. Unfortunately, there's no mechanism in state law for anyone who carries a split estate holding in California to actually control all 100%. So, and then you have section 9C, which goes one step further and says that the operator must be able to ensure that there will be no future penetrations of the storage container by a mineral rights owner. And in California, and there's lawyers, thank goodness, at the table, they're going to hopefully help me out here if I butcher this. But in California, the mineral state is dominant, and so if you have a mineral rights owner subsurface to the storage container, they have every right to take a piece of the surface that you may own, drill a hole directly through your storage container, and go get those minerals. But CARB says that's no longer a certified project if that has the ability to happen. So what folks in California are looking at doing is creating a statutory framework to effectively resolve what we call the 9A and 9C problem, which we think will go a long way to actually being able to certify an LCFS project.
Do you think we're getting there?
I think we are getting there. Okay. I actually think we're going to get there in 2020. I think we're going to get there by 2024. We actually really hope we're going to get there this year.
So you get $85, because we're just talking that that's going to go through, $85 for geologic storage in a saline aquifer.
Or depleted, and I want to clarify, or a depleted oil and gas reservoir, so long as it's a Class 6 permit. Right. And then there's one more piece on the credit. So stacking incentives is, and this really makes no sense to most people when they think about California's cap and trade program, but right now, to use easy numbers, If I capture and sequester 1,000 tons of CO2 off of a obligated reporting stationary source in California that's required to purchase cap and trade obligations, I don't also get to reduce my cap and trade obligation by that 1,000 tons. CARB is going to be engaging in cap and trade rulemaking in 2023, post-adoption of the scoping plan. We think we have high hopes that that's going to get resolved. And so now if you look at mid-decade cap and trade forecasts, which is going to be right around 55, depending on who you talk to, $55 to $65 per ton, 2030 closer to $85 to $100 a ton. You're now talking about a stacked incentive or cost avoidance framework that for every ton of CO2 that you're capturing and sequestering, you're getting anywhere from $250 to $300 per ton for that effort.
A little bit more likely why we have so many companies.
Yes, definitely. And this is particularly a problem for refineries because the way their compliance obligation is calculated is not based on strict emissions; it's based on their production. So they don't see that reduction in their compliance obligation if they're doing CCS. And with regard to the pore space, the requirement is in California, the pore space goes with the surface rights. That's what we call the American rule. There's the English rule that it would go with the mineral rights, and there's a few states where there's suggestions of that the English rule could be followed, but it's mostly the American rule, unsurprisingly. But it's just not codified anywhere in the way that would give greater certainty. And because you have to own 100% of the surface area over your storage complex, which depending on the underground features could be pretty large, there's just a huge process involved in acquiring all of that land. You're vulnerable to acquiring 95%, and then the few holdouts hold you hostage. And like you said, with the mineral estate, that can give the mineral estate owner the right to drill down. So you have to also negotiate with those folks and get them to agree not to drill into the storage complex.
It's both.
I think it's a property right issue. I mean, under the CCS protocol, there is liability. The CCS project operator is liable for any escape of CO2, and then in California, that includes both escape to the surface and migration out of the storage complex. So it's important when you're modeling and permitting where the storage complex is that it incorporates all of the areas where the gas may move.
California is one of the only states in the U.S. that actually has that settled.
Yeah.
I mean, Texas, North Dakota, Wyoming, Louisiana's working on it. So pore space ownership and liability for long-term storage.
But one point to be clear on is that it's not exclusive liability for the CCS project operator. The credits can be invalidated at any time, and CARB could choose whether to go after the project operator or to go after the refinery or whatever the fuel supplier is who's generating those credits. And depending on the creditworthiness or the size of the entity or just, what CARB is looking to accomplish, they might decide that the easiest option is just to take away credits that were in the fuel supplier's account.
We have to make sure we're talking into this. I've already been told no. So I want to make sure that any other questions from the audience, you have time.
Question for Edwin. Edwin, very good indicated announced, some of the approvals. A lot of the parties are pretty big, Pembina, TC, and obviously you guys. Yeah. And there's, they approved 5 or 6 hubs in the province. I get what the Bloom hubs, you need to be close to the blues, you want a shorter pipeline, all that kind of fun stuff. Do you see, Edwin, room for slightly smaller players to enter the space? I mean, you really want to make a difference with climate change, the more parties that get on board, the better off you are. But obviously, you're recruiting with lots of things. One is, the cost of the pipeline, where the polluter is, your carbon sink emissions going into. But you see sort of, billion-dollar companies getting involved, $5 billion companies, $500 million companies. Do you see us migrating there in the province and Alberta and Saskatchewan? Do you see that happening?
I think that's I think that's the benefit of the hub model. I think if I'm just thinking about your question, like I think in terms of the hub model, that allows a smaller emitter to be able to use that, that scale of the project or whatnot to be able to actually sequester. But I think like within Alberta and Saskatchewan, just given the fact that there's so much existing infrastructure already in the ground, I think that enables a smaller emitter to be able to capture emissions. And I know we've had some conversations over the years, like when we think about like Weyburn, for example, that area. But I think those smaller projects are going to be tied to EOR as opposed to like cashing in on the federal ITC. Because of the economics, that's right. Yeah. So I think that's where you're probably going to see those smaller projects kind of come on board. But I think also like tying some of those smaller projects to like the production of hydrogen and things like that. Like I think that's also where you'll get some of that economy of scale. And then also when you think about the Canadian clean fuel regulation as well. Like I think primarily in the oil and gas space, like if you're able to use CCS and generate a CFR credit for $200 a ton, right? Like I think that creates a significant opportunity for a smaller emitter as well, who may not be able to leverage that federal FTC if they can leverage or generate those CFR credits. I think that'll certainly incentivize it too, which is interesting. Like kind of going back to your conversation, like in California, we're not able to kind of like double up with that stacking piece. I think that's interesting. Like so far in Canada, I think like that stackability is kind of still in place where you're able to, decrease your, emissions under, this OBPS system, which we've got, but then you're also, able to, generate these CFR credits so you can kind of stack, right?
Yeah. Climate change has so many acronyms, right? OBPS, output-based pricing system, CFS, clean fuel standard. When is that actually going to get out?
I think the clean fuel standard is coming into play, I think January 2023.
But then the rule is supposed to be out like June.
This year. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That come into force this year.
So just let us know if the acronyms get too heavy. But, I mean, if you work in climate change, we have acronyms. IPCC, CER. Question in the back.
Hey, as you and I were discussing lunch a little bit today, I was wondering about the panel approach and talking about the voluntary carbon market component of this outside of the compliance. So continuing with the conversation about the credit stacking, there was a number of different protocols in development. You looked into that specifically, any of them that are in development, or are you bullish on any one of the, let's say, Aera marketplace, Aera, the gold standard, any of these, or any of the existing legacy methodologies? Do you see benefits going one direction or another, or is the market going to be more locked in a compliance direction for the time being?
So I'll just speak from my company's perspective. Our focus is on reducing our compliance obligation under California's cap and trade program, and to take advantage of low carbon fuel standards. So it doesn't, as an obligated entity, it doesn't allow us to avail ourselves of an offset program through a methodology like that. I do know, though, that a very good friend of mine who could not be here today, Maris Densmore, is actually working on a CCS, a voluntary offset protocol for carbon capture and sequestration at American Carbon Registry, and I think I'm hearing that that's coming this year. So I think that's going to be a positive for, I think, to speak to the stacking credit program. I think that's going to be a positive for the industry and allow these projects to go forward. But from Aera's perspective, we're operating primarily to reduce our obligations and to take advantage of California's low carbon fuel standard.
We actually got our start. Bluesource actually got its start with the ACR methodology for CCS. So, I mean, we're at Bluesource very excited about what's going on at ACR and VCS, so American Carbon Registry and the Voluntary Carbon Standard, Verified Carbon Standard now. Both of those organizations have methodologies. They're going to do different things. ACR's is primarily on deep saline and EOR, where the Vera methodology, the VCS methodology, is going to be modular in scope. So they'll have one supposedly on EOR, deep saline, on the transport, on the capture, hopefully on the utilization in, like in cement. There is a methodology today at Vera for carbon cure, which is CO2 in cement, but that's the only one today.
So, Jen, I just want to touch, though, I mean, voluntary offset program, an industry CCS project, right? I talked about pore space, the 3 Ps earlier. I think the big last P is permitting. And in California, at least, where we operate exclusively, it is a spaghetti bowl of permits, and really driven by California's Environmental Quality Act process, or CEQA. And so I think unfortunately, until California gets serious about permitting reform and identifying a way to streamline and de-risk the permitting process for carbon mitigation projects or renewable energy projects that aren't utility-scale solar in the state, then you're going to have a very hard time moving any type of CCS project forward to take advantage of the crediting opportunities.
Even with voluntary carbon, I mean, you still have to deal with Class 6 well permitting, or Class 2 if you're doing UR, and don't forget about the pore space ownership and liability issue. So even the voluntary offset will have to deal with pore space and liability.
Yeah.
So that means it's going to be limited to the states that actually can deal with that.
I don't know. I'm in the government affairs side of our shop. Our business development folks handle all of that, so I'll turn it over to other people on the panel.
Maybe Andrew can answer.
I mean, what I can tell you is that I'm working on projects that are based solely on 45Q. So 45Q, depending on this, and of course this is all very location dependent, right? You have the well, which is a cost, and you have the pipeline, which is a variable cost. And if you can have those very close to the source, that changes the economics. But there are projects that are going forward solely based on 45Q. So that's enough, depending. I think voluntary credits would be really useful to expand that universe of projects that'll be, viable with the additional offset credits. And I also think that there'll be a very interesting addition to the voluntary market, because the permanence, the quantifiability, the additionality of the reduction it'll be in a different league than a lot of the offsets that are out there now.
When you only have 2, there's no question about additionality. You only have 2 saline storage facilities in the U.S. Only 2.
Exactly.
Additionality is not going to be a problem.
Yeah, and the permanence from deep saline and from oil reservoir storage is pretty well established, and I think the quantification too. Subpart RR has been around for a long time, and the companies that are doing EOR have had to keep track of the
Do you want
CO2.
to say what RR is? UU versus RR?
Sorry, subpart RR. That's the provision of the EPA regulations, which requires monitoring of CO2.
More stringent.
Sorry?
Okay, anyway. Edwin, did you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think, like for us, it's around, $85 a ton. That's kind of the number that we're working at. So when we think about the carbon price escalating in Canada up to $170 a ton by 2030, certainly that creates, certainly economics around, the benefits of CCS. And then talking about the voluntary market, I think the one thing I was going to mention, and going back to your question about Saskatchewan and Alberta, not to get too complicated into the weeds, but in Saskatchewan, what they're going to do is if you are generating CCS credits, they're going to help you sell them on the voluntary market. So I think they're kind of driving things away from the compliance market towards the voluntary market, just because they don't want to flood the market there with credits, and there's a number of different reasons for that. But I think, in short, I think for us, when we think about the voluntary market and maybe you're getting $20 or $30 a ton, I don't think the economics are there. But certainly I think if you link it in with the federal ITC, or like a 45Q, for example, I think that certainly enhances the economics to the point where it makes sense.
Arthur, you have a question? Can you guys
short
hear that
answer,
question?
short answer, Arthur, is yes. And I'll just repeat the question
Thank
is
you.
in
Thanks.
California or from our perspective, will a hub system help support adoption of CCS? I think the short answer is yes. And that's evidenced by our company, Chevron, a lot of other players in the southern San Joaquin Valley, strongly supported with with Governor Newsom, Natural Resources Agency, an application to Department of Energy that was just approved, I think about a week and a half ago, for Kern County to actually be one of 22 Department of Energy, and I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but essentially technology and advice grants or technical assistance grants to develop a carbon hub in West Kern County. And it is, we're working closely with Kern County Planning to actually figure out where do these get sited, how big does that hub need to be, what does the county need to do in order to facilitate the siting of sources and sinks in a way that makes it as economical as possible, to where you could do it maybe with just an expanded 45Q, but that it actually becomes a core business model in the California economy, to essentially as a decarbonization business, going forward.
So I think the permitting and those aspects are going to be easier with a hub because you have combined resources and more companies advocating for the project. But the commercial discussions can actually be a lot more difficult. Anytime you have the source and the sequester are different entities, you're already going to have a discussion about what are the minimum volumes. The sequester wants to ensure that they have enough CO2 to get the credits that they're building this system for, and the source wants to ensure that the sequester can take enough of their gas in order to get the reductions they want. When you have a hub, you're going to have those negotiations between multiple parties, and you're going to also have to think about a priority waterfall for the pipeline and for the capture equipment if there are multiple, because you could have the hub be just the pipeline and the sequestration source, or you could have the unprocessed gas sort of feeding into capture equipment and upgrading that's covering several facilities. And you need to, some folks are going to want to have priority for and ensure that they get to give X amount of gas. Others are going to want to be more flexible, and I think those are very complex commercial negotiations, and because this is also new, there really isn't a set formula that people will just say, well, let's do what that other project done. It's all kind of being developed bespoke by each project as they go.
Why is it? I mean, hydrogen, you used to think of hydrogen is going to be 20 years out. It's going to be part of the solution. And CCS was a long ways out, and it was going to be part of the solution. But now you hear about hydrogen and CCS a lot together. Why are the two starting to merge? Edwin?
I don't know. I think there's a couple of reasons. At least when we think about it at Enbridge, I think hydrogen and CCS just kind of go together just in terms of when we think about the production of green hydrogen, for example, which through SMRs or steam methane reforming, really to make sure that you have the benefits of that green hydrogen, you have to have CCS tied into it. So I think for us, that we really see as CCS and hydrogen being enabling the transition to a lower carbon economy, right? So I see from that perspective, that's why they really go together, and they both kind of go off of that hub format as well, right? So you've got your CCS, and then you've got your hydrogen hub, and you've got your supply and demand dynamics kind of attached to that. And I think the other benefit there too is just thinking about pipeline infrastructure. You've got your natural gas pipeline infrastructure already in place. Some of that might be able to be reused for CO2 pipelines. You might be able to do some blending with the natural gas and hydrogen, for example, as well, just from a distribution perspective. So I think they really kind of go together, certainly just when we think about decarbonizing at least the natural gas component of our energy sources to help us reduce emissions, at least in the short term, until we can get to a point where we can start producing blue hydrogen at a more sorry, I got my colors wrong. Generating green hydrogen at a more economical price. So that's where I kind of think about it. Oh, green and blue and turquoise, and there's purple now, yeah. So green is the production of hydrogen from hydrolysis using renewable electricity, And green hydrogen is the production of hydrogen from natural gas using steam method, or steam methane reforming, or I think there's a number of other methods as well. I think what is pink is with nuclear.
Pink or purple? Yeah, because Arizona Public Service is doing when the sun shines, they use the solar and they divert the nuclear electrons to make hydrogen.
The pink
And
hydrogen.
It's either pink or purple.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. There's lots of different colors, but
Who
yeah.
knew you could have pink?
Yeah, and I think these distinctions are often kind of based on like the co-benefits and how people feel about the underlying sort, and whether we're trying to really get rid of oil and gas and have green hydrogen instead of blue hydrogen, which will still be based on fossil natural gas. And if I could be controversial for a moment, I think what we really need to focus on is the carbon intensity. It's possible for blue hydrogen to be lower CI than green hydrogen, and what really matters is what we're putting in the atmosphere and what we're getting out of that.
I like that. Why would that be controversial?
Well,
Because you don't like the colors. Do we have other questions in the audience?
Because we live in California.
Huh,
Yeah.
okay.
I guess one other point is that, if you're an oil refinery in California, implementing CCS on your SMR will reduce your Scope 1 emissions, but you still have all the Scope 3 emissions when your fuel is burned. If you converted your SMR into something that's producing blue hydrogen, the CCS takes care of your Scope 1 emissions, but then your customers also have no Scope 3 emissions because the hydrogen is clean burning. So it's the other half of the emissions equation, and it's just kind of match made in heaven.
And a lot of companies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I will note, though, is that from an oil and gas production perspective, a pre-combustion, post-combustion CCS project can, if done with renewable power, can resolve almost the entirety of an oil and gas producer's Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for those barrels produced by the steam where that CO2 is being captured. So, obviously you have Scope 3 emissions from the supply chain inputs and the refined product once it gets put in the common pipe, but you do resolve almost the entirety of your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for those processes.
Any more questions out there? Because I have one more. Question back there?
Yes. So so the question was, I mentioned 12 to 14 bills in the California State Legislature addressing CCS. Do any of them specifically address permit streamlining? The one that does, well, there's three. Two of them are on demonstration projects. Senate Bill 905 for concrete CCUS by Senator Nancy Skinner. And Senate Bill 1399 by Senator Wykowski for just up to 3 general industrial facility demonstration projects. The third, though, which is not specific to CCS but to renewable and carbon mitigation projects in the state of California, is Senate Bill 1136 by Senator Anthony Portantino. That's probably one of the broadest support bills by industry, by labor, by some environmental groups to move forward a comprehensive and cogent permitting structure in California for these projects.
Cool. So, we got a lot of momentum. I have to say, though, I've been there, done that, and then it went away. Do we think that this is here to stay? Do you think that, what's going to be the key to not only success, but keeping it going, not letting this fall backwards?
I don't know. I think from my perspective, it's really policy certainty and durability, right? And I think Canada is very similar to the U.S. in the sense that if you get a change in the administration or a change in the government, at least in Canada, for example, looking at, we've got an escalation of a carbon price, $15 a year out to $170 by 2030, right? If a different government comes in and they decide to abolish that, certainly a lot of the economics when we look at it, that kind of goes away, right? So I think for us, and it's certainly policy, durability, and longevity, right? Like, in order for us to make an investment decision, you kind of need that, right? Like, your economics are tied to that. So I think for us, really that whole policy piece is very critical in being able to plan, right? Yeah.
I don't know why more people don't talk about how flip-flopping on policy is bad for investment, it's bad for policy, it's bad for the environment. Anyway.
So, Janet, in California, I'll say, I think it's twofold. One, if we get legislative action this year, because I think if the legislature does something and the governor signs it, then it's on the books and it creates a pathway to move forward. I think the other piece is the scoping plan, right? You heard Chair Randolph today acknowledge, and other people have acknowledged, CARB is the global leader on climate policy, period. And this is an if, but if we get a resounding endorsement of CCUS or CCS in the scoping plan draft that will be issued in May, as well as an acknowledgement of the barriers to CCS implementation in California in that same scoping plan draft, and then that draft language is ultimately adopted when the scoping plan is adopted by the board in November, December, I think that's the policy signal for at least the next 5 years, if not the pathway to net neutrality in 2045, that industry needs, that investors need, and that other policymakers, not just in California, but globally need to have this technology move forward.
And I think it's more than 5 years. I mean, I think you need to have policy certainty for more than 5 years. So 2045, that helps. Andrew, what do you think?
I think the climate situation kind of creates the need for CCS to stick around. I mean, all of the estimates for how we can get to stay within 1.5 or 2 degrees, they all include CCS. And the latest IPCC report essentially says that it's theoretically possible to meet the 1.5 degree goal, but practically very difficult, and we're really going to have to struggle to meet 2 degrees. And I think any climate approach or plan that doesn't include CCS is, in my view, not really a serious plan. And I think it kind of casts a shadow on the whole enterprise if we're going to take the one really proven technology that reduces the most difficult to abate emissions and discard that. It's got to be a piece of this of the solution.
I wholeheartedly agree. Policy certainty, companies that are interested, having the financial wherewithal. Yeah, it's true.
So
can I jump in? I just have to.
So
I'm
go ahead,
totally
Jen, 'cause I was going to make a very
economist, I just have to do this
political
one.
response,
Okay.
so go for it.
So on offsets, on CCS, you're spending a lot of money. So if you're going to spend all that money, you're going to do a lot of things. Because offsets, you're spending money on a company like me. I'm happy to take that money. But a company is going to think about that money and go, geez, I should do X, Y, and Z inside of my own shop before I start spending money, or maybe a little bit after. So I think there's an economic justification for starting early, getting going. Offsets can give you an early start. They can do a lot of good things. But at the end of the day, you're going to do internal mitigation because that makes financial sense for you. Same with CCUS. Sorry, I just had to get
No, so I'll just say, I think we deal with this a lot in California. And I think it's, at the end of the day, even if you have a light and medium duty internal combustion engine ban in 2035, you're going to have a need for petroleum or hydrocarbon-based transportation fuels through 2055, if not 2060, or longer. And why not do it? Why not provide those fuels? And to Andrew, your point, with the lowest possible carbon intensity values available, and you can get there with CCUS or engineered carbon removal technologies. And I'll go one step further, you can actually begin to resolve the Scope 3 emissions from the refined fuel with direct air capture, right? So it's sort of, it becomes, which, then you need, not to toot my own horn, but you need oil and gas companies to then take that carbon and put it back in the ground, right? Because we know how to do it, and we know how to do it best. And so I think you begin establishing CCUS on industrial source emissions is the pathway to resolving the overall Scope 1, 2, and 3 emission solution for hydrocarbon-based transportation fuels, not just in California, but nationally or at a greater level.
Yeah, there's just a lot of reasons that fossil fuels are going to stick around. I mean, not only just we're having an energy transition, and that transition is not going to occur overnight. 10 to 20 years is optimistic, and during that time, the emissions that are occurring during that time matter. We're still going to need fossil fuels for plastics. That's not something we've found an alternative to, and there's still heavy machinery, tanks. These things are not going to go electric by 2035, even if the California consumer, passenger vehicle market does. So fossil fuels are going to be around, and to say that we're not going to reduce those Scope 1 emissions because it might, encourage us to keep using fossil fuels just seems to me, again, it's not really serious. It's
Good question. So I want you guys to join me in thanking our panel for what I think was an interesting conversation.